Good evening, my friends. Wednesday, I beguiled you all with a tale of one of the most prolific demons of Tennessee folklore. Tonight, I share with you a story told to me of a personal encounter regarding this creature. Now gather round and listen to Encounter with a Demon in the Bell Witch Cave. Several years ago, I moved to Nashville for work. While I was there, I had several crazy encounters and came across a lot of stories. Even the building I worked in was said to be haunted. Unfortunately, I never stayed past the time in which the activity was supposed to have occurred. At one point, I met a coworker whom we'll call Sharon. It was toward the end of my time in the city that I discovered Sharon had a great interest in the occult, as her own major in college had been in theology and religion. On some dull days, she shared some of her paranormal research with me, and I in turn shared with her several of the paranormal experiences I had while living in the mountains. I had a habit of bringing a book with me almost everywhere I went, and this was around the time that I discovered creepypasta. So I had gotten on a horror kick and began bringing ghost story anthologies and other spooky works relating to the paranormal. On one of these days, I happened to bring one of the books I mentioned as a source in my previous video, Charles Edwin Price's infamous Bell Witch of Tennessee. When Sharon saw what I was reading, her eyes lit up and she almost hopped out of her seat. I hadn't seen her so eager over anything else before, so I had to know what piqued her interest. It was then she told me this tale. When she was preparing her thesis, her research led her to learn more about various demonic entities. Since the renowned Witch's Cave was close by, she and 4 or 5 of her friends got together to go inspect the place where the last known sightings of the Bell Witch occurred. Now, visiting the property on which the Bell Witch wreaked her havoc means you can take a tour of John Bell's cabin, the cave, or both. As of this story, it's like $8 for the cabin and $12 for the cave for you adventurous types who want to go see it. For those that want to actually see the cave, there are a few things that you should know about going into it. Firstly, the cave was formerly the ancient burial site for a Native American. The outline of the grave itself is still there, but the bones and any funerary items that were buried with the person were long since taken by thieves. In fact, one of the many reasons the Bell Witch supposedly claimed she was angry with John Bell was because the property his cabin rested on was once a burial site. Secondly, there is a great outline upon the wall of what appears to be the profile of an old woman's face, with a long nose, round cheeks, a prominent chin, and a strong forehead, the quintessential profile of a fairy tale witch. This image, in fact, is thought to be an impression of the witch's own visage, visible to the masses. Finally, while the owners allow you to only venture so far into the cave, experts believe the full length of the cave extends over 15 miles. That being said, areas in the cave have been roped off for a reason. You see, anytime there is heavy rain, the lower basin of the cave floods. Some areas wind up with water over several feet deep, all kept bitterly cold by the smooth rock surrounding it. In addition, some of the passages are very tight, and one little slip could wind up with you wedged in a crevice, of which you may not be able to wriggle out. No matter how brave you are, you should never go past areas that are marked off. I repeat, never go past the areas that are marked off. If the guide says to stay on one side of the barrier, don't be an idiot and hop over the moment they have their back turned. Nobody wants to go on a search party and potentially get themselves injured because you were determined to win a Darwin Award. There's also one more reason you shouldn't go past the barriers. You might upset her. The night Sharon went to do her research, she had in her party a man whom we'll call Mike. Mike was one of those guys that lived on his own bravado and was forever goofing off. He behaved as though standing in one spot for too long might cause him to stagnate, He didn't know the meaning of the word quit and would take literally any dare you threw at him. Which is why he decided to be a hotshot and try to impress the girls he was with that night. All throughout the tour, whenever the guide was out of earshot of his group, he'd snicker and laugh and make brash comments to the spirit supposedly dwelling within the cave. A lot of, "Oh, she ain't gonna do nothing to us," and "she isn't coming out 'cause she's too chicken-scratched too." You know, the sort of stuff you want to avoid saying to a demon. You know, the sort of stuff you want to avoid saying to a demon that plagued a family for years and eventually killed one of its members. Well, eventually, the tour guide started to backtrack, with Sharon's group bringing up the rear. Sharon noticed that Mike was lagging behind, eventually stopping. When she asked him why, he waved her on. "You guys go on ahead," he told her. "I'll be along in a sec." Shrugging, Sharon walked ahead to catch up with her other friends. Mike wasn't that far behind. Surely he couldn't get into that much trouble on his own, right? Right? Sharon's small group finally made it outside, but Mike didn't join them for another 5 minutes. When Sharon decided to ask the tour guide if he had seen her friend, she noticed Mike running out of the cave. At first, she thought it was to just catch up to them, but as he neared her, his face read another story. He'd gone pale and looked absolutely petrified. Mike caught himself on a tree near them, his breath heaving as if he had just finished an Olympic run. Sharon reached out to him to ask what was wrong, but the moment she touched his shoulder, Mike hopped up with a yowl and began grabbing at his ribs. This freaked out the entire group, as all Mike could do was swear in confusion as he frantically tore at his shirt. Sharon had no idea what was going on until Mike yanked the bottom of his shirt upwards. At first, she saw nothing, just pale, smooth skin. Then suddenly, long red welts appeared, each one bisected by pinprick thin lines of red that slowly began to ooze. Sharon didn't understand. How could Mike's flesh be whole one moment and suddenly covered in claw marks only a second later? Sharon demanded to know what Mike had done to himself, and he was shaking so bad he looked like he might pass out. According to Mike, he lagged behind so he could hop the barrier and explore further into the cave. After walking for about a minute with nothing happening, he, of course, decided to taunt the Bell Witch. Only this time, something within the quiet solitude of the cave didn't like that. Mike said nothing more, and Sharon was never able to get more out of him even years later. Whatever happened after he pulled his foolish and potentially dangerous stunt had been enough to send him bolting terrified from the cave. Sharon was also never able to figure out how such huge claw marks suddenly appeared over his sides like that, as there had been nothing to indicate that Mike had scratched himself up. Whatever happened to Mike was enough to ensure none of the group ever returned. So, my friends, upon hearing Sharon's tale, remember this word of advice should you ever visit the Bell Witch Cave. Never walk past any area that is marked off limits. And never taunt the Bell Witch. Well, my friends, I hope you all enjoyed this story. Tune in next Wednesday for another spooky story. If you need your fix until then, go check out my revived creepypasta channel, Mountain Eyes Narrations. Good night, and see you all real soon.